Hello and welcome to the second part of Talking Europe, coming to you from the European Council in Brussels. My guest today is the Foreign Minister of Latvia, Mr. Edgars Rinkevics. Hello and welcome to the program.
Hello.
Latvia currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Union until the end of June 2015. Now, this week has been a very intense week of diplomacy, focusing on the Greek debt crisis and on the conflict in Ukraine. Let's get the latest on efforts to resolve that war in Ukraine.
A glimmer of hope to end the bloodshed. After marathon overnight talks lasting more than 17 hours, the warring parties in the Ukrainian conflict finally reached a deal, paving the way for peace after 10 months of fighting. The deal states that a ceasefire will come into force at midnight on Sunday, and 2 days later, the withdrawal of heavy military equipment will begin. A demilitarized zone will then be set up around the current front line, and both sides have 19 days to release their prisoners. Brokered by France and Germany, President François Hollande called the deal a comprehensive political solution and a real chance to improve the situation on the ground.
It's a real hope for Ukraine. It's also a huge relief for Europe, and it's a great example of what France and Germany are capable of achieving for peace.
But all parties agree there is much work to do, and issues of contention still remain. Further talks will now be held about the degree of autonomy in parts of rebel-held Donetsk and Luhansk, and Kiev is still adamant on retaking control of its 400-kilometre border with Russia.
Between now and the end of the year, border guards must retake control of Ukrainian borders.
The Russian president said it wasn't his best night, but it was a good morning, but blamed Kiev for stalling.
Incidentally, I believe the length of the talks is linked, regretfully, with Kiev's refusal to enter into direct contact with representatives from the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics.
Hollande and Merkel will now ask the European Union to support their grand plan, but a previous ceasefire signed back in September, also in Minsk, fell apart as Ukrainian government troops and pro-Russian rebels fought bitterly for control of territory in the east.
Foreign Minister, does Latvia have a plan to de-escalate that situation in Ukraine?
We cannot actually solve the situation in eastern Ukraine while there are no key elements of Minsk agreement implemented. First, the border control given back to Ukraine, I mean border between Russia and Ukraine. Second, definitely also we should speak about the limitation line between separatists and Ukrainian forces, withdrawal of all military equipment, and of course immediate ceasefire is the part of plan. And then of course we have to deal with greater autonomy for eastern regions of Ukraine. We still have to see the implementation. If there is implementation, if there is a ceasefire, I think that gradually we can move to more stable Ukraine and more also prosperous Ukraine.
If there isn't implementation, would arming the Ukrainian side be the solution, in your opinion?
I personally hope the diplomatic solution is going to prevail, but I also cannot exclude the heavy deterioration of situation in Ukraine, and also let's not forget about economic situation of the country. It's also very heavy.
We'll come on to that later, but just to be clear, so would Latvia be in favor of militarization if there's no implementation of the diplomatic agreements?
Well, I'm not going to speculate right now. So far, what I have been telling to journalists and also during our discussions that we do not have EU policies, let's say, of arming somebody. That's individual member state competence, and Latvia does not have such capabilities.
On the question of economic aid, you just alluded to that. Of course, it's a very important issue, and you've recently called for more sort of forceful engagement with the Ukrainian economy. Do you get the sense that your European partners are really holding back on this?
I think we all understand that Ukraine needs long-term economic assistance. Ukraine needs also assistance in conducting social, legal reforms, political reforms. But there is also the broad understanding and requirement on the part of EU member states that we also have to see results. There shouldn't be only kind of promises, but we also want to see results.
You think they could do a lot more in that direction, despite the security situation, despite the fact that, of course, this war in the east is costing the Ukrainian government a lot of money?
This is a very difficult situation. You have to fight a war, and you have to fight a war against separatists that are supported by far superior military power in the region. At the same time, you also have to handle challenges that range from economic and energy situation to political and legal reform. At the same time, I believe that at this point in time, the Ukrainian government has made right steps already. And I think that we have to encourage the government of Ukraine to continue with those steps. I'm not saying they are not doing enough. I say that the hardest part is actually ahead of all of us. In order to really turn the corner, Ukraine needs money, and it needs money not in May, it needs money right now.
You mentioned a far superior military power in the region. I think that brings us to security issues in the Baltics, and Latvia has reported Russian planes flying in Baltic airspace with their transponders switched off. Tell us a bit more about that and what you think Russia might be doing in the Baltics.
We have reports from Sweden, from Denmark, that at least twice last year civilian aircraft has come very close to military Russian aircraft with switched off transponders, actually endangering civil aviation security, and we take those things very seriously. Of course, we also have noted increase of Russian military presence, both on the ground around our borders, also in Kaliningrad Oblast, also many flights, many ships. So at the same time, I have to say that there have been very adequate NATO decisions last April as well as last September during NATO summit in Wales. We have our allies on the ground and also patrolling airspace. So I do believe that there is not going to be a kind of direct military intervention. What we, of course, are following very closely is a new concept, 21st century concept of hybrid warfare. Cyber warfare, information warfare, also the phenomenon we have seen in Crimea, in Ukraine, in eastern part of Ukraine, so-called Green Man. So we are following very closely those developments. We are discussing them with our NATO allies also here in the European Union. I think that we have to be much better at strategic communication of the Union, tackling Russian propaganda. Those are all elements of this so-called hybrid warfare. So we are not panicking, but we are also aware that the situation is much tenser than it used to be, let's say, 2 years ago.
So you wouldn't go so far as to call for pre-positioning of NATO troops in Latvia, which I know has been suggested by some national security hawks in the US. That would be going too far.
Well, we already have our allied troops exercising in the Baltic states and rotating. However, if situation deteriorates, and right now I see that it deteriorates, I would say that reconsideration of some NATO policies, also probably the permanent stationing of NATO troops shouldn't be ruled out at all. However, already we have a decision by NATO defense ministers that have been taken this week that there are going to be command elements, host nation support elements, logistical elements, and I already mentioned allied troops that are permanently right now rotating and exercising.
Latvia, of course, is in quite a sensitive situation, as you've just heard there. It's a country that used to be part of the Soviet Union. It has a border with Russia, and it has a Russian-speaking minority, which is roughly a quarter of the population. Just to take a closer look at that situation inside Latvia, let's have a look at this report that was filmed by France 24's Julie Dungelhoff and Alix Le Bourdon.
His neighbours might be flying the national flag, but Dimitris keeps his head down as he passes their house. His parents came here in the 60s from Russia when he was just a baby and when Latvia was still part of the USSR. Yet even after 55 years in the country, he's not been granted nationality. And without Russian paperwork, he's technically stateless.
So, this is my passport. And you can see here is writing alien's passport, which means I am an alien in my own country, which is really upsetting and unfair in my understanding.
When it gained independence, Latvia granted citizenship to those living in the country before it was annexed by the Soviet Union and to their descendants. As for the immigrants who arrived after 1940, part of Stalin's Russification of Latvia, they became non-citizens, a special status within Latvian legislation. The community numbers almost 300,000 people, yet very few of them apply for naturalization.
Being a non-citizen, you are able, without visa, to travel to Russia. And that's an important issue for them to keep status of non-citizen.
Another obstacle is the mandatory test, a 3-hour session which involves reciting the national anthem and completing a multiple-choice questionnaire on the country's constitution and its history.
Yeah, would you translate the question number 18 for us?
Okay. What was happening in Latvian culture after Second War? There was Russification in Latvia after Second War because we was occupied by Russia. Yes.
This is where the trouble arises for some Russian speakers. The word occupation can be problematic, as some still believe Latvia's adhesion to the USSR was voluntary. Others, like Vitaly, choose to put their version of history to one side in order to pass the test.
I need to acquire nationality for professional reasons, for my career. Naturalized citizens have certain privileges. It's easier for them to buy property, and they can also work in the public sector.
Naturalization means the right to vote and to be elected. In 1999, Niels Usakovs was technically stateless. He applied for naturalization. Today, he's the mayor of Riga. His party's considered pro-Russian, but he's proud that 35% of his electors are of Latvian origin.
We managed to create right now the first and actually the only, at the moment, political force that is supported by both Latvians and Russian-speaking Latvians.
There are over 600,000 Russian speakers in Latvia, and half of them are non-citizens. The challenge now is to integrate this community into a society that's still marked by 50 years of Soviet rule.
Foreign Minister, you've talked obviously very frequently with your Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and something that has come up in your discussions is this idea of a Russian space in the former Soviet Union, a place where ethnic Russians or people who feel themselves to be in some way Russian are kind of together in a cultural space. What does that actually mean for Latvia, if anything?
Well, yes, I visited Moscow in January, and we talked also about so-called concept of Russian world, which, as my Russian colleague explained to me, is about cultural, linguistic links, and you don't need to be Russian. You can speak Russian, or you can love Russian literature or culture, and then you belong to that world. It's like a concept of francophonie or something like very close to British Council ideas and so on. At the same time, we also hear a lot of people saying that Russian world actually is the Russians or Russian-speaking minorities that must be protected by all means, including military means. And there's such kind of provision, I think, that some people in Paris, London or New York should also be worried as well, because you also have Russian minorities, actually, when it comes to figures, much larger Russian minorities than we in Latvia or in Estonia. So we still cannot figure out how much we are talking here about culture and how much we are talking here about some more imperial ambition. But what we have seen happening with Crimea, what we have seen happening in the eastern part of Ukraine, let me say, worries us quite a lot, and that's why I was talking about the need to counter what we call information warfare by all means. It's not only in the Baltic states. I think that's now already the issue for the whole European Union.
One final question I want to ask you about. Obviously, a big topic for you in this presidency is the Greek crisis, and Latvia itself has gone through its own austerity program, so you have a lot of experience of this kind of thing. Do you think that on a point of principle that Greece should be allowed a basic renegotiation of its debt?
Well, of course, it's more for Eurogroup to decide rather than for presidency. Presidency does not have so direct role. But I can say that you are absolutely right. In 2009, 2011, Latvia went through very tough structural reform process and austerity measures. We regained our growth. And I do believe that the way how we were handling the crisis, implementation of the program as it was agreed with European Union and International Monetary Fund, is the only way how you really can get your financial and economic health back. And I really do believe that arrangements that have been signed must be honored. And I really don't see the way how we can talk about giving privileges to one country. I don't see how we can create a situation where some are more equal than others. I think that the Union can hold and Eurogroup can hold only if we all stick by agreed rules and implement them.
Right.
So my firm conviction is that on this issue, while we respect the decision of Greek people, we cannot look at the ways how to, let's say, get some countries in a better position than others.
Right, so no two-speed Europe within the Eurozone.
No two-speed, no two-class Europe.
Not
within
two-class
and
Eurozone.
outside.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Foreign Minister Edgars Rinkevics of Latvia, and that's all for this edition of Talking Europe. Thanks for watching.